Good evening. The Henry Sheldon Museum acknowledges that we do our work on Abenaki land. We recognize the indigenous cultures and people that existed in Dakina homeland long before Europeans arrived in North America. We commit to policies and practices of cultural equity to benefit current and future generations. Welcome to our inaugural talk of the series Elephant in the Room, Exploring the Future of Museums. We invited artists, scholars, curators, and cultural visionaries from across the country to help us take a critical look at our current museum operations so we can truly incorporate diversity, equity, and inclusion into our collecting and exhibiting practices. Our speakers will address a range of topics, including collecting habits, experimental exhibits, what historical maps and early photography can tell us about the present and the past, what one can learn from in archival collections about sex and gender, as well as whether museums can become relevant public squares of civic discourse. My name is Eva Garcelon, and I'm the archivist at the Henry Sheldon Museum in Millbury, Vermont. We are a small private institution with primarily historical collections. This year, we are celebrating the 200th anniversary of the birth of our founder, Henry Luther Sheldon. Next year, we will be commemorating 50th anniversary since our archives, the Stewart Swift Research Center, were established. So this is actually a good opportunity and incentive to ask questions that many museums are posing right now. Whether we are here in rural Vermont or in New York City, on Paris or Belgium, the questions are very similar. Whose stories are we telling, and who is missing or obscure in our collections and exhibitions? What is our role in our communities? Who are we serving? And how institutions with historical collections can offer relevant, meaningful programming for the 21st century audiences. As curators, we are not just collections keepers, but we must challenge ourselves to break with traditional one-dimensional interpretation of our collections. We have an obligation to respond to today's social justice issues, promote understanding and healing, build empathy, and create more inclusive narratives with focus not just on class, race, and gender diversity, but also to expand definition of these terms so more of us are represented, acknowledged, and included. We hope that the series Elephant in the Room will bring national debate closer to our regional community and offer opportunity to engage in a conversation between museum makers and goers. So we can perhaps blur the divide between experts and our communities and move closer towards building a more just future. This lecture series was organized by Stewart Swift Research Center of the Henry Sheldon Museum with generous support from Vermont Humanities. And all our presentations will be virtual. They will take place once a month, always on Wednesday. With exception of today's Wednesday, it will be always on the second Wednesday of the month at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, with concluding talk in April of next year. And we hope to see you here, whether for all or some of the talks. And now I will pass my voice to my colleague, Taylor Rossini, who will expand on what I wanted to say and give you some instructions. Thank you.
Hi there. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight for our inaugural lecture of the Elephant in the Room lecture series. I just have a few Zoom housekeeping notes before we get started. So this is a Zoom webinar format, which means all attendees are muted and without video for the duration of this program. You're invisible. So the best ways for you to communicate with our panelists are via the chat function at the bottom of the screen and via the question and answer function, which you'll also find at the bottom of your screen. So if you'd like to hop into the chat, we'd love to hear you say hello and maybe where you're zooming in from so we can see how far afield our attendees are. And so just to note during the Q&A, you can direct questions throughout the program into the Q&A function. And once we finish the program, if you'd like to raise your hand to ask a question, we can go ahead and unmute you and you can ask your question on video live to our attendees. There is closed captioning available for this program, which you will also find the function for at the bottom of your screen by the Q&A. So this event will be recorded, so if you have to step out or if you'd like to rewatch it, you will be able to do so after the fact. And without further ado, I will pass it back over to Eva to introduce our wonderful speakers for this evening.
Yes, hello again. Artists play an essential role in many societies and cultures, especially during troubling times like war, societal upheavals, and obviously national traumas. They help us navigate through painful and often incomprehensible moments. Today we'll hear one such extraordinary voice belonging to multidisciplinary artist and thinker Dario Robleto in a conversation with another remarkable person, Ellery Foutch, in a talk, Living with Death, How Artists, Historians, and Museums Create a Meaning in a Time of Loss. Today's presentation is co-sponsored by Middlebury College, several departments and programs, including American Studies, Studio Art, History of Art and Architecture, Associate Dean for the Arts, and Middlebury College Museum of Art. Thank you very much for your generosity. Dario Robleto is an artist and writer living in Houston, Texas. His work has been exhibited widely and is held in prominent collections, including the Harvard Art Museum and the Whitney Museum of American Art. He has held research fellowships in a range of cultural and scientific institutions, including the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. He's currently serving as artist at large at Northwestern University's McCormick School of Engineering and at the Block Museum of Art. Ellery Foutch is an assistant professor in the American Studies Department of Middlebury College, where she teaches classes on the art and material culture of the United States. She received her PhD in the history of art from the University of Pennsylvania in 2011. And she has held postdoctoral teaching fellowships at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. Ellery Foutch is also Sheldon Museum valued trustees, and she taught several classes using our collections, both museum and archival. And just recently, she curated a couple of mini exhibits, including one on the relics collected by Henry Sheldon. Thank you very much and welcome Dario and Ellery, and I will mute myself. Thank you.
Eva, thank you so much. I'll start my screen sharing here in a moment. Do we have an image? I'm hoping there's a thumbs up somewhere. Terrific, thank you. It is such a pleasure to be here this evening with Dario Robleto. It's kind of a dream come true, and I'm so excited to see in the chat such a vast array of locations that you guys are joining us from. This is such a treat and a delight. And since so many of you are joining us from further afield, I'm just going to open with a little bit about the Henry Sheldon Museum and what sparked these kinds of conversations and discussions. So you're seeing on the screen our friend Henry Luther Sheldon, who, as Eva mentioned, is celebrating his 200th birthday this year. And in honor of that, there's this very lecture series, as Eva mentioned, as well as a series of exhibitions and a few classes that I've taught related to Sheldon and his collection. So you see here on the screen Sheldon himself and the museum he founded here in downtown Middlebury, Vermont. And Henry Sheldon started this museum in the 1880s, and it really proved to be the passion of his life. You see an entry, he got very reflective on New Year's Eve every year and mused about his activities. And in 1881, he wrote, "I've spent all my leisure the past year trying to benefit future generations by preserving the handiwork of the articles representing all the different occupations of the early pioneers, which I have called a museum. May those who many years hence look at these articles take as much pleasure in doing so as I have in collecting them." So I hope you'll all feel that this evening. The Sheldon Museum is really remarkable in being a small town museum and one that was founded by a sole collector who was not a wealthy individual. And so the collections in many ways are this really interesting snapshot of 19th century culture, Henry's eclectic interests, and the kind of material culture of everyday people of Vermont. And he was avidly collecting and documenting very self-consciously, not only his community, but his own life. I'm showing you here two examples of objects in collection storage. He was an avid card player for almost every birthday. He organized a card game and actually inscribed on the playing cards which occasion they were used for. Here from his 80th birthday and also his 85th. He recorded things about his old blanket from the 1830s, preserving it for the future, reminding us to use plenty of mothballs. And he went to kind of an extreme in the instance of this collection of his teeth, which he's very carefully labeled with Roman numerals to indicate the year of extraction. Like a lot of 19th century collectors, he was also really fascinated with relics, collecting fragments and pieces of the past or of significant sites and assembling them into this small town in rural Vermont. Here, glass from the ruins of the Paris Commune, or a cup that he crafted from part of the Alden House. He descended from William Alden and the Pilgrims, so famously used that connection frequently in his work. But he wasn't just an avid collector, he also formed this really interesting creative practice, I think, in which he assembled these relics into new compositions that I find really extraordinary and meaningful, and objects that help us think about the very act of memory making and construction of material objects. I'm showing you here one such composition, his relic chair or memorial chair assembled in the early 1880s. And what is so extraordinary about this object is that each spindle, each of the wooden supports of the comb back of this chair is a different relic. It's from a different site of historical significance, local, national history as well. So he has up in the left corner, you're seeing a ledger in which he recorded the origin of each site, from our town's Congregational Church to the famous Charter Oak, where they hid the Charter of Connecticut during the Revolutionary War. There's a whole conglomeration of sites embodied in this chair, in this single material object. And in working with my students and thinking about my own research, I have been kind of struggling or grappling with what it meant to take these pieces of the past and bring them together into a single object. Wasn't it a little horrifying in some ways to destroy or take a fragment from these other objects into your own recreation? What happens with all the sawdust? Is that also a significant object or fragment? And throughout the Sheldon Museum's storage collections, we also see some of these kind of leftover fragments. And in preparing for the 200th anniversary of Sheldon's birth, we searched through collection storage to look for objects that help tell the story of Henry Sheldon and his historical moment, but that also might make meaning to us. And so as part of that, there's a wonderful exhibit curated by Eva Garcelon-Hart, Taylor Racina, Lucinda Cockrell, and others, kind of documenting Henry's life and practices. And I also worked to bring these objects together, some of which in these instances are left over from the construction of the relic chair, to create an exhibit that was about kind of meaning making. So here you see an installation view of the relic chair with some of Henry's so-called relics, the fragments of sites of historical interest and significance that he assembled together in these meaningful ways. And I have to say, it's a very special museum that would let me exhibit a shirt collar box full of chunks of wood and allow or invite visitors to think about how that might carry meaning or not for them. So I'm showing you here a few installation views of this relic exhibition. And you can see some of the artifacts that Sheldon himself made. In these instances, in the foreground here, a knife and fork whose handles are also made with wood from the Alden house. He claimed to eat every meal with these. A leaf from the Charter oak as well. And so you get a sense of the range of Sheldon's collecting practice and how significant this was to him. And even as it seemed very eccentric, there are also ways in which it echoed popular collecting practices of the time. And one of the objects that I became really fascinated with in my research is this Sheldon Memorial Bell that was created in 1893. It looks like a very quotidian object, kind of a gong type artifact. And yet he found it to be, or he put so much effort into assembling objects and artifacts to create this resonant, if you'll excuse the pun, this resonant object as well, assembling not only coins from around the world and across the span of historical time, but also, again, a different kind of fragment. Filings from, you can see here just some of the source materials he used, filings from a sword used at the Battle of Bennington, bullets from various battlefields, including the then not so distant Civil War, a filing from a bell cast by Paul Revere. And he assembled these objects, artifacts, and mailed them off to a foundry in Connecticut, where they melted these down. And as you can see with the leftover, made these souvenir buttons in some ways. And I was so surprised by this material turn, this really transformative use that no longer can discern the individual artifacts, historical artifacts, but instead they're brought together and subsumed entirely into this one object. I learned that this actually wasn't, Sheldon wasn't the only one doing this, and he might have also been inspired by a drive sponsored by the Daughters of the American Revolution for the 1893 World's Fair. A newspaper article from the time invited readers to send in articles of historic interest. And I'm reading from the article now, quoting, gold, silver, bronze, copper, and nickel can be fused. In forwarding material to be melted into the bell, fullest historical descriptions should also be sent. Persons having historical treasures too valuable to be melted into the bell as a whole can send the committee the smallest filing. For example, they have applied to the regents of Mount Vernon for the smallest filing from the key of the Bastille, which was presented by General Lafayette to George Washington. At the same time the bell is produced, it is proposed to have manufactured out of sword and war materials contributed for that purpose, a plow and pruning hooks, that they may accompany the bell, thus typifying the fulfillment of the prophecy, the sword shall be beaten into the plowshare, and the spear into the pruning hook, and men shall learn the arts of war no more. The swords of two officers used in the War of 1861, the Civil War, the one on the one side and the other on the other, they elliptically say, contributed by their grandchildren, have already been received for this plowshare and pruning hook. And so I found this to be this really fascinating amalgamation of objects that often had a material connection to war, violence, and loss, repurposed into this stunning object. And I was trying to wrap my mind around what this all meant, and how we might make meaning or convey this significance to today's viewers in a moment of our own historical significance and loss. Even as this looks like a very quotidian object, it carries so much meaning and weight. When I was working on the Relic Chair project, I had a really generative collaboration with the Chipstone Foundation. And in one of our conversations, they were chatting with me and asked, kind of out of the blue, are there any contemporary artists whose work this project makes you think of, or who might help you understand or convey to your students this work? And I immediately answered Dario Robleto, because Dario's practice is this remarkably evocative study of objects and the meaning they carry, and ways of making sense of grief, of longing, of the historical past, of our own historical moment, and how we might work together towards a new future. And one of the things that I find especially moving about Dario's work, and that the relic practice made me think of, is that in addition to these beautifully crafted objects and striking titles, his list of media and materials that sometimes in other artistic practices is very, very perfunctory, right? Oil on canvas, gouache on paper, marble. Instead, so often the materials used in the practice are enormously meaningful and evocative and transcendent. And it helped me think through or grapple with the questions I had about Henry's practice. Are these artifacts, well, do I believe that this is a piece of wood from the Charter Oak? I'm relying on Henry's handwritten label. What does it mean to make a fragment out of something significant and important and valuable? What are the ethics of that? How do we grapple with war in our own historical moment? And so in 2021, when we are in again, another moment of profound historical loss, the loss of life with the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks and all of the subsequent ricochets from that, I was hoping to turn to Dario Robleto to help us make meaning of that. And I'm so delighted that he's joining us tonight. So Dario, I hope you'll tell us a little bit about your practice.
Yes. Thank you, Ellery. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to Ava and Taylor and the museum for having me. And thank you to everybody in the audience for spending a Wednesday night talking about kind of a heavy topic. I hope it's worthwhile, though. And Ellery and I are sharing a screen, so I'm going to have to ask her to help me advance the slides. I'm not bossing her around, but I'm just politely asking to help me advance. Yeah, and I mean, Ellery, it's amazing. I'm so sensitive to the history that I come from as far as the tactics that I use as an artist, especially things outside the art world, and learning about Henry's logic. I feel so connected to him. And you hit on some great points that I think we're going to dig into more: ethics and trust, a truth to materials, and the main thing, though, is our responsibility to each other when those materials are handed down through time, which I take very seriously. So what I'm going to try to do to build off of all the great things Ellery laid out for us is I'm going to specifically talk about work related to 9/11, and then Ellery and I are going to circle back and dig into something I think I'm excited to talk to her about the relevance of that day to our practices. But before I do that, I wanted to just give a little bit of background. I'm going to show you two works tonight. Both of these works are pulled out of what ended up becoming a 10-year body of work, which I could not have predicted at the time. So I'm giving a small sampling of a much broader project. All the works need to stand on their own, and that's fine. But I just wanted to say that this is turned into a 10-year meditation. Over 50 artworks were made, and I've chosen two tonight that, at least for myself, I don't know if they're the best works of that body of work, but they were the most complicated, problematic works for myself to make, which I'll be happy to tell you more about. And, this is a tough topic, and we're going to talk about, we already have, and we're going to continue to talk about some complicated things. And this tonight means a lot to me because of that investment I gave into questions that arose from 9/11. And although my work has moved on to some other topics, I really wanted to revisit this work tonight. So I haven't talked about some of this work in years, so I'm kind of excited to do it and to play our part in remembering this anniversary that just passed recently. So, but I wanted to start by just sharing two quotes from two different wars, separated roughly by a century, that I think sort of kind of summarize the core problem that I meditated on the most during that 10 years of work. And it was this deep question of grappling with what is the function of art and the responsibility of an artist in a time of war. And there are quotes that I think also get to this, what seems like a seemingly unbridgeable divide between the home front and the front line. And these are two conceptual places and real places that proved very influential to the work. Ellery, can we go to the first quote here? And I wanted to show you both an artist who served in a time of war, which a lot of my work spent a lot of time thinking about that role of becoming an artist during or after serving in war. But he says something profound here that has always resonated with me. He says, and this is him being, a soldier after the fact, grappling with the process that inevitably happens after every war. He writes, "It's true, we will forget. Oh, I know, it's hateful, it's cruel, but why get incensed? It's human. The veils of mourning will fall like dead leaves. The image of the lost soldier will fade slowly from the hearts of those who loved him so much, and the dead will die a second time." And that last line, "the dead will die a second time," just still to this day, it just breaks my heart in half, because why should I accept that? Why should any of us accept death a second time? And he means through the act of forgetting. And if we can go to the next slide, I just want to fast forward now almost a century this happened just a little over a month ago, but Army General Austin Scott Miller, who was leading the Afghanistan war, who gave over the power to the Afghanistan generals, this is what he wrote. Our job now is just not to forget. With the families that have lost people across this conflict, it will be important to know that someone remembers, that someone cares, and that we're able to talk about it in the future. And so we have these calls that repeat themselves through every war. I just picked two. You'll find this in every war, people saying similar things. And I view it as this existential gap that the front line feels to the home front of being forgotten. Of course, we all know that many of us don't, especially the families who are anxiously awaiting the return or safety of those soldiers. And so I think these quotes, they describe these competing attitudes within humans between, on one hand, this extreme form of empathy, and then on this other hand, this callous, almost, psychologically necessary disregard that many of us need to go through. And I'm really fascinated that of our species, that we're capable of both of these ends, of extreme remembrance and extreme forgetting. And I really feel that of my role as an artist, and that art more broadly, this is where it wants to operate in, between these two poles, and with a purpose, which is to always continue to tilt that balance towards empathy, to never let it get so out of whack that we completely forget. So there are challenges to this point. Does art or aesthetics have any role at all to play in the face of such horror? And I take that criticism very serious, and I hope we can talk about it a little later. I have a slide to talk about it. Ellery, can we go to the next slide? And so many people have argued that part of that problem, that gap between the front line and the home front, is largely, a result of the dwindling percentage of the civilians who have to engage in that given war. And when I first came across these statistics, they just stunned me. In the era of drone warfare and cyber warfare, these numbers are going to somehow drop even further. And that has a profound consequence in when we remove ourselves from visually seeing the consequence of any given war. And that really deeply concerns me. And Ellery, can go to the next slide. All that to say that certainly the first battlefield photographs of the American Civil War definitely changed the public's attitude about that war once they could start to see the tragedy of it. The Vietnam War, perhaps would not have been as contentious if not for the fact that it was our first televised war, so that people could see what was happening in the name of our government, or behalf of our government. But even, with this vital work done by many generations of war correspondents and war journalists and photographers, there is still so much left unseen. And what I'm particularly interested in is when we move into these levels of abstraction that perhaps the human mind is not really capable of understanding. For example, the number of dead of this war, and Ellery can go to the next slide. These numbers are just staggering, and it's like I said, it's psychologically difficult to absorb what tens of millions of people dead, and then the equal number or more who are maimed, what that means in its totality. And it becomes this psychological fatigue problem, I think. And like I said, whether just because of the limitations of the human brain, or what worries me in our time, of course, with advancing technologies that encourage us to forget more rapidly and definitely encourage a shorter attention span. So these two things are hitting in conflict. Increasing lethality of our weapons while perhaps dwindling attention spans of the viewers back home. And like I said, what I would argue is that this is, where art can play a role. And as Ellery alluded to as well, I think of course, we're seeing this problem again, I think, with the staggering number of deaths from COVID, and as well as this generation of environmental loss. The problem is seeing it. We have to be able to see it. And I think a lot can be done in that, not only in a documentary sense, but where the works I'm going to show you are to try to take on these other abstractions, like 7 million civilians dead, 20 million wounded. These are just numbers. But I want, through my work, at least this body of work, to tackle these abstractions and to try to draw the humanity back out of those numbers so that we never become so disattached to this. So these kind of points I've laid out, what's the function of art in a time of war? How do we increase empathy, even given forces working against that, so that we can absorb another person's loss? And if there is this connection between increasing our empathy and seeing things, but seeing the things that are inherently abstract, then how does art function in that zone? And we can ask it a slightly different way. Ellery, we'll go to the next slide. Here are 3 questions that are very important to me as I worked on this body of work. How does one bridge the gulf between the home front and the front line? How does one learn to remain loving in the face of sorrow? And how do we account for the unaccounted? And that last question is where I want to jump off with this next piece. We can advance now, Ellery. Because when I really started grappling with those numbers, those abstract millions of numbers of death, of the dead, it occurred to me that there was another number, there was another abstraction that was an outgrowth of those numbers, which is all of the life, all of the children that would have been born if the soldier had returned home. And we don't usually put that in this already staggering total number. So if 10 million people died, how many people never had a chance to be at all because the soldiers didn't return? And so I wanted to find a way materially and sculpturally to try to visualize this other abstraction of the life that could have been. But here's like with what Henry did, as Ellery laid out, this problem of, this is why I'm so drawn to materials, because I think they can do this type of work for us. And so I spent a long time just thinking, what is a material that represents the non-existence of beings that could have been born? And what I came to land on was, we can go to the next slide, Ellery, is the incredible wealth of letter writing that occurs in any war. And I started fine-tuning this, and I read thousands of letters of war, various wars, and I started to notice something. There were particular sections of letters where soldiers specifically wrote about the family they hoped to start when they returned home. And that gave me the clue that the intention, the desire, the love, the reunion that one hoped for when they returned was transferred in a very literal sense into that ink on the page. And it was a promise. Unfortunately, they didn't return home. And I set aside, it took me many years to find a number of these letters. And I set aside and did the homework to find out who didn't make it home of the batch of letters that I found. And so this dress is made of the pulp of those letters. It is sort of the way I think of it is it's a child mourning its own non-existence. And the design of the dress is drawing off of some material cultural mourning traditions that we'll also talk about more in a little bit, of the way, especially in the Victorian period, the way the public would publicly show their mourning of loss through the way they dressed. So this is modeled off of a customary dress a child might have worn, whose father perhaps had died. But to dig in a little more in the wonderful way Ellery did with the specificity of that material list and the shavings that Henry Sheldon melted down, I'm working in a similar logic. So it's not just the pulp. We can go to the next slide, Ellery. The curlicue design elements that you see, the black element, this is actually ink that's been reconstituted by scraping it off of the original letter and making a new batch of ink out of it, and then using that ink to dye dipping paper, cut paper into it. So it's reimagining the language on that page now as a design of mourning. So everything has been used in some new way again from the original materials. The fabric is also a piece of fabric from an actual mourning dress of the period. This is somebody who actually mourned in that fabric. That was very important to me to use, as well as the hair braids, the hair flowers that I've used in this piece. These are also elements. It's a combination of materials that I reconstructed and materials that I purposefully sought out because they had been used. And that's an important conceptual point that Ellery hit on too, that we're relying on the fact that these materials already had a history before I got to them. Because this is one of those ways that I feel such responsibility, memory is handed down through time, is that real life was lived in these materials. So I'll turn to the second piece now. I'll tell you two quick questions that helped frame this last piece here. Can art finish that which was never finished? Can art right a wrong? Many people who know my work know the role of asking questions as the initial stage of making the sculpture. And I really need to ask some provocative questions that perhaps don't really have an answer. I don't know. I don't know the answer to these questions, but I'm trying to find out. And so with those two questions in mind, I'll tell you the next piece. Just a little preface. But the other thing that milestone, as far as an abstraction of loss. So we have this, category of humans that should have been, that could have been, but weren't because of another loss. And I was in the years of research, I was stunned to learn of another historical milestone that we don't often ponder, which is when in history did our technologies of war become so efficient that people could now literally disappear on a battlefield, either through explosion or being sucked into the ground, never to be seen again, especially with the trenches of World War I. But this is a horrifying but important conceptual moment to remember, that people literally turned to dust and vanished. And what that did, and why I became so interested in it, is because it played havoc with customs of mourning. In particular, that you could bury your loved one. This basic fact that we have some physical material as a body to mourn. For hundreds of thousands of people, this was upended in World War I. We can go to the next slide, Ellery. And it's a really stunning thing, again, with abstractions. We don't often consider this milestone of when could we vanish during a war, nor do I think we have often a grasp of the millions of tons of material that humans have now shot across boundary lines at each other, that are now slowly sinking into the ground. To this, every year I keep my eye out on it. We still find ordinances from World War II, World War I. People are injured, or people have to diffuse bombs. My point is that probably everywhere we walk on this planet, if you dug down deep enough, you're probably going to hit some materials of war. And they become oddly a type of geological strata And this really moved me because of all our discussions about materials tonight, but also about the invisibility of it and how that relates to a lost loved one. So we'll go to the next slide, Ellery. And so this is the piece I made in response to some of those thoughts. And I was really moved again by a story I came across from World War I. And essentially what happened was, because of this new milestone of invisibility of a loved one in a time of war, many of those families were so grief-stricken that after the war ended, the government in France and in places, but particularly in France, put money aside for people to go out and bring those bodies home. Of course, this was not well organized. Nobody moved as fast as those families needed. And I was just stunned to learn that bands of people, mostly women, took it upon themselves to go out into those fields after the war and start looking, trying to find something to bring home that they could bury. The problem is, and this is where, I think psychologically they were hit with the abstraction that they also had to materially solve, was that nobody could identify any of the materials. So a fragment of uniform, a wedding band, a medal, a fragment of a letter, all of this suddenly had to become everybody's rather than a singular family's or loved one. And although I have yet to find any visual documentation of this piece is me imagining, back to this point about can art sort of finish something that was never finished. I imagined, what would I make for those women to carry with them out into those fields? What is the object? What is it made of? And more particularly, what would they find? So we'll go to the next slide, Ellery. And this is what I came up with. What you're looking at is, these are all, like Ellery hinted at it as well, these are all materials of war. This is a very important conceptual point to me, which is that every material had to have been somehow in the context of war so that I could find its opposite use, to upend its original point of violence and find an act of care within it. So this basket is made of shrapnel and bullet lead from various wars. The fabric lining the edge there is from a mourning dress. The wax bouquet that those finger bones are sitting on are also from various types of acts of mourning. We'll go to the next slide, Ellery. And just a close-up, but this is, a difficult object, but it alludes to what I mentioned earlier about these materials becoming types of geological strata. And so I imagined that somewhere down deep below the earth, one war, time is collapsing, and one war is slowly folding onto another one through materials. So the bones of one generation are slowly getting coated with the bullet lead of another. And perhaps a wedding band finds from yet another war, finds its way onto one of those fingers. And so this is me imagining those women picking through that devastation, hoping to find something that they can properly mourn and bury, but having to contend with this new reality of this compression of time and space, but a compression of loss too. Everybody's loss, as I said, had to be represented in a single object. No single person could claim it anymore. And that is a horrifying thing that needs to be remembered and noted, which I think has, great relevance to 9/11 as well. So I'm gonna pause here and hand it back over to Ellery so we can continue the conversation a bit.
Always a challenge to find the right button push. Specifically meaning on Zoom, but Dario, thank you. These are such moving and evocative and fraught works. And I am struck especially by this kind of continual return to and practice of an attempt to engage with loss and grief, and how that practice has animated and suffused so much of your work. And so I was hoping you might be able to tell us a little bit more about the kind of, you've presented this as a really marvelous archival and intellectual project. And I'm wondering also, kind of biographically speaking, how this line of inquiry and practice opened for you.
Well, the 9/11, as I know with you, which I definitely want to hear your response to that too, is it changed everything. I was just starting out as a young artist, and like everybody who witnessed that day, there was a before and an after. And I remember within minutes, I had the appropriate, response, but I also, because I was in the midst of figuring out the function of art, which I still am, inevitably I had to ask, what can you say in such a moment? Can art do this? And more specifically, beyond anything I make, just what is an artist's responsibility in a time of war? We can go to the slide, Ellery. And it really disturbed me that I didn't know the history of artists in a time of war. And, not that art history and art school necessarily needs to single that out, but it bothered me that I didn't know. I didn't know the lineage, because I really, like every artist and everybody who wanted to engage in that day, we were going to have to grapple with some big questions about what do we really believe when it comes to art, as far as its ability to respond, to alleviate, to care, to mend. It's one thing, if there is a type of scale of tragedy, this one is just such a shock to the system that it inevitably calls into question your most hopeful take on art. And so I started doing my homework, and I knew from that day forward that I couldn't do anything else until I dug into this problem. And we show the next slide, but this very famous quote that I'm sure many of you are aware of, but when I stumbled on this quote, as many do each generation, it shocked me. It shocked me. To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric, by a famous philosopher of art, Adorno. To be fair to him, we don't have time to dig into the context of that quote and everything. So I'm going to just stick with my introduction to it and the rawness that it hit home to me. And it remains a provocative statement. And I think he gets to the core of what I was feeling that day, which is, do I believe in this or not? That art has some role and function to play here. I don't agree with him, and to be fair, I think he was being provocative too. I don't think that's totally his position, but nonetheless, it's a wonderful way to state the problem. And I've grappled with it. I continue to grapple with it. I had no idea that it would set forth 10 years of almost single-mindedly working on this problem. I even at one point came to the conclusion that should an artist be dealing with this topic as long as their country is at war? I had no idea we were about to enter the longest war in US history. I made 10 years into it, and that was only halfway, which is something I reflect on quite a bit. But my position, again, to be fair, I don't think he totally meant it this way, but just to keep with the spirit of the provocative nature of the statement, and some, I think, criticism I've received, which I listen to and I don't shy away from at all, which is how can what I just showed you, even with my hopefully empathetic intentions, like with that dress and that basket, how is that an appropriate response to, over 20 million deaths? And I don't know the answer, but I know that I believe in this principle that art can do some type of work along these lines. And over the years, I've had wonderful feedback on that, not just criticism, but deep engagement with many veterans. And I'll never forget one time, and I'm not trying to highlight something that was good in my favor, because I take the criticism too, but one of the most meaningful moments I ever had was with a veteran who I was showing my work to. He told me, he grabbed my hand and he told me, "I'm so glad you can touch these materials, because I never can again." And he kept in touch with me, and he actually sent me shrapnel that had been pulled out of his body in World War II, and wrote me a beautiful letter telling me that now he knew what to do with it. He never knew why he kept it, but he just did. And he had it in a drawer, and he just left it there for decades. And when he saw the work, he thought, oh, okay, maybe art can do something that I'm incapable of doing anymore, for all kinds of psychological reasons. And if art can do that type of work, whether it's making an aesthetically interesting object or opening a conceptual pathway for that veteran to have a type of healing, or at least a type of passing on, then I am all for that, and I proudly and gladly take that responsibility on to be the carrier of these objects moving forward. But anyway, I'm going on a bit, and Ellery, part of the excitement of this talk tonight was that you and I both had very existential like reflections on our practices after 9/11 from an artist's point of view. And I would love to pass the question on to you and hear anything you'd like to add in that way.
Yeah, I think it's always, or art historians, and cultural studies scholars aren't necessarily used to being self-reflexive in terms of autobiography. But yeah, I think September 11th changed everything, and changed so many of us in deeply personal and intellectual ways. I remember that Tuesday was, I think, the second day of the second week of grad school for me and my cohort at the Williams graduate program. And we were scheduled to have a methods class that afternoon. And I think I was slated to present something about Linda Nochlund's Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists, actually. And our professor, we all gathered in the classroom at the same time. I think it was 2:45. And our professor asked us what we wanted to do, if we wanted to have class that day, if we wanted to kind of go on and try to impose a sense of normalcy on the day, if we needed to stop. And I remember us sitting in that seminar room together, having this conversation about kind of what it meant for us to be sitting in this darkened seminar room, potentially talking about pictures. What were the ethics of that? What did it mean, for us to be safe in Western Massachusetts in the midst of all this death and suffering, in a place that Sterling and Francine Clark specifically, in a location they specifically chose in the aftermath of World War II to be safe from any kind of fallout or bomb dropping. to kind of keep that art collection and legacy safe. And yet, yeah, what does it mean for us to come together and think about pretty pictures? And one of our classmates suggested that maybe that was the best thing to do, that there needed to be people in a time of war, or what was looking like it was going to quickly turn into fomenting towards war, thinking about creativity and creation and kind of the bigger questions that humans grapple with. And I think, I think you mentioned that it was kind of the start of thinking about your artistic practice still, and what it meant to be an artist in general, let alone what it meant to be an artist or someone who's consumed with thinking about art in these times of historic cataclysm. And so I think I'm still working through kind of what is the value, or how can scholarship and careful consideration of material objects be an ethical or moral act that helps people make meaning of the kind of completely incomprehensible, or what does it mean to think about art and objects even as buildings collapse and all of this changes so profoundly for us. And I think we're also maybe grappling with that right now with the COVID epidemic, as you and I have discussed as well.
Right. Do you want to, let's show some of those images of maybe we'll go forward a bit to the COVID images, looking at our time here. Ellery and we had a wonderful discussion. We're both independently curious about how is the public, in this case, artists as well, but I'm equally interested in the public, stumbling forward in tackling this basic abstract problem I'm trying to go on about putting some visual understanding to what is really an abstraction, 700,000 dead. And, these two recent things, as far as the history of material culture, that do this type of work for us. I'm sure many of you have seen this cover of the New York Times and the recent planting of the white flags. Maybe we can pop back one or two slides just to give a little context here. One more. What I'm trying to get at. We'll go back one more, Ellery. A concept that fueled most of my work about the war, which when I see things like that cover of the New York Times or the flags, and I'm sure you too, I can locate it in my head as far as a lineage of everyday people. It's important to me to point out that it's not art makers necessarily, it's just people, because I've always been fascinated with how grief and loss provokes an aesthetic response in people, just people who have no art training. And because to me, there's some clue there about this question about, does art have any role in a time of war? And the best answer, beyond the experience of that veteran, the best answer I've ever found is just look at the past. The people who themselves weren't pondering it as a aesthetic question. They were just in the deepest state of grief and took it upon themselves to make these elaborate hair braids, to collect their tears, coming up with complete new designs for the public display of their mourning through their clothing. The bell, Henry's bell that we talked about, fully fits into this category. And my point is that I call it the logic of loss. And I'm so fascinated how loss can provoke, chemically, certain types of aesthetic decisions. Not just aesthetic decisions, but the desire to make something. And so what does that say that at some primal instinctual level, the human brain is designed in such a way that grief would provoke people to make creative objects or materials or write a poem or write a song without it ever having to come under the term art. And that is what I'm very sensitive to through all kinds of tragedies, from roadside memorials with bikers, all the way to the COVID images we just showed. There's a beautiful, largely unwritten, because it's parallel to more proper art history circles. There's a beautiful alternate history of aesthetics that I find in these objects, and the fact that these things exist long before I ever grappled with Adorno's question was part of the answer I needed to know, which was, oh yeah, we're humans. We do this when we're in pain, for ourselves, but also for others, because we need to show that we didn't forget. And that counts. That really does count. Anyway, if you want to add anything, Ellery.
I think that sense of grappling with both the immediate loss and kind of historical legacies of loss and grief is what I found so compelling about a lot of your work, and the ways that museums can potentially help us try to make sense of our own losses and griefs as well. The way that graphic designers at the New York Times work together to try to represent this kind of unrepresentable, inconceivable scale of loss that we've talked about by deciding to print just 1,000 names, showing the extent of that loss as only just 1% of the losses. And I think this too, I keep thinking of the parallels. We talked about this a little bit on the phone, the parallels between war and the ongoing pandemic, even the rhetoric of the frontline workers and the home front, the way that so many of us were kind of in enforced isolation and limited to the home. And so I think, yeah, I'd love to hear more from you about your reactions to this.
Well, Ellery, also looking at our time.
Well, yes, and we have 2 days.
I want to continue on that, but maybe we should turn to some questions.
I would love to do that. I'm going to stop my share. Should we invite Taylor back to moderate our Q&A for us?
Sure. All right. Thank you both so much. We have had questions from like minute 5, so people have a lot of thoughts. So the first question is from a historian, Bill Hart. He says, as a historian who deeply values written documents, especially handwritten letters, how ethical is it to scrape off and reuse the ink of those old letters to create a new form, the process by which the old letters are destroyed?
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is a great question. And I think Ellery hinted at it as well with the alterations of those metal shavings to melt down. Here's my response, and not everybody agrees with me. That's fine. Well, one, I would say that the information, it's very important to me that information retains itself. So I always photocopy those letters. The information as written language is not lost, but you have to make a leap here, and it's, I think, one of the interesting things about our practices. What flexibility does the artist have as opposed to a historian? And here I would say is an interesting one. There's more than one way to remember and engage with those historical documents. We sort of take it for granted that there's only really one way, which is to look at them, put them under glass, and appreciate them, for all good reasons, I'm a scholar as with you. I'm not debating that purpose, but it's not the only way. And so I wanted to find other ways, and as I said, I'm part of a lineage. Many people do this all the time, of engaging with those materials that you could argue that through that remixing, it unlocks a totally different narrative and story, a totally different possibility for public engagement through the form of that dress, as opposed to, as written language on paper under a glass vitrine. They're two different experiences that I would argue offer different pathways to the same spirit of what we're after, which is to remember and engage and to expand our capacity for empathy. Tied to that, for me as an object maker, someone invested in materials, down to the molecular level I'm interested in, is you have to make another big conceptual shift here, which is to make a distinction between construction and destruction. And if your mode to do that is alteration, you have to make a leap that there's not something inherently wrong with, or there's not something inherently destructive in the act of alteration. There can be, of course, and I think intention has a lot to say about that, the person making the alteration. But my ethics about it, and I do think it should be framed as an ethical question, but I would argue that I'm responding to an ethical call to remember those letters in a way that have not yet been remembered. I don't know, I'm sorry, I think his name is Bill. I don't mean to, I really want to grapple with what you're asking because it's an important question. I don't know if that does it for you as far as a reason, but as far as an object maker invested in ingenuity in how we engage with past materials, this is one of the tools that I use. This may be relevant or not, but I also have a long and rich history in DJ culture. And the idea of remixing samples is crucial to my kind of conceptual premise of the way I think about any information, whether it's material or just textual. And the core philosophy of sampling is there are universes to unlock by remixing something. And that's just a deep-rooted belief in all of my work. But I don't know. Maybe it's not. I don't know if he wants to follow up on that at all. And Ellery, you alluded to it as well in your talk. I don't know if you want to add on to that.
Well, I don't think I've thought of it in this way before, but this the way you described it this evening is kind of making me think of a different way of thinking about Walter Benjamin's The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. In that the mechanical reproduction can contain the information or the kind of documentation aspects, and yet you are transforming the thing itself, the real thing, for its material qualities into this work of art. And mechanical reproduction makes that possible. In some ways, it's also, I think, a different thing to think about in our historical moment in terms of our kind of obsessions about touch and surfaces in terms of viral spread right now. I think it makes things resonate differently as well.
All right, another question from Lisa. Do you think art's role is to help us bear witness to what we can't see, but invites us to experience a fuller, richer picture of our shared humanity? It seems that's what your work, Dario, allows us to do.
Yes, if we can just make that initial step of visibility, which would allow for bearing witness, that, as an artist, that's huge. I've got to make that leap. And as I mentioned, I try to find problems that I don't know have been visualized yet as it relates to grief. Like, millions of children that were never born. So how do you visualize that? I'm just drawn to trying to find new ways to do that. So these things, because like I said, as a category of loss in our official death tolls from every war, nobody ever thinks to add on that other number. And it's partly because we can't see it. We just don't know. We're not conceptualizing it. So I think, yes, that one of art's fundamental functions is to visualize, and from my hands, that's always ultimately to expand empathy. But you have to have that linkage of materializing, bearing witness, which then opens the road to these other ways of empathizing. Do you have anything, Ellery, you want to add?
No, I think that's kind of without essentializing the human experience and accounting for the ways in which everything can be so contingent in a social historical context. There's also this deep way in which that bridge of empathy, I think, is allowing historical connections in really exciting ways.
Now, not so much a question as a comment from Sarah. The human mind seems unable to grasp, confront, or react to the enormity of news and numbers. We're seeing it today with the huge numbers of COVID losses. The numbers mount up and some people remain unmoved to take action. But give someone a work of art, such as the basket with mourning tokens and actual human fingers with rings, and that makes it personal, more understandable, and more horrifying, and forces the viewer to engage and mourn on a more personal level. We need the shock of the immediate and the small and the personal to bring it home to us.
Yeah. Yeah, that's wonderfully put. Yes. Yeah, that's better than me stumbling through that. I won't add on to that. I agree.
And let's see. Another, it seems that any one war, any national trauma could easily consume a career and a life. What is it like to work steeped in that loss and grief, and how do you move on to new topics after that?
Oh, God. Yeah. Like I said, I didn't know I was entering 10 years of work. And I mean, to this day, I have guilt that I didn't continue with my early commitment that I would follow along as long as the country was at war. Because after 10 years, yes, I have many interests. The other things have come up, but I've never let go. And I wouldn't say the themes have left even my more recent work. Everything I ever make will have the residue of that 10 years of work in it. Loss, how we respond, the creative response to loss is just hardwired into everything I do as an artist. But it's a tough question because you always want to check yourself, or I do, in proclaiming any hardship, emotional hardship that comes with making that work. It does. I mean, making that ring finger basket was very difficult emotionally to earn the right to touch those materials, let alone, just figuring out how to technically do it is a huge thing to overcome emotionally and psychologically, especially using human remains in artwork. But, ultimately I came down to, so anyway, my point is that there's definitely an emotional toll that comes with it. Plus just my premise, as Lisa mentioned too, the bearing witness, it comes with baggage if you're going to do that. And part of my life as an artist has been how to negotiate and find a pathway through this commitment to never blink, to never, ever blink. Always look at the worst and the best. But I have a saying that artists don't have the luxury of forgetting. And I really mean that. I really do. But yeah, it comes with the price. But I don't put that burden in anywhere near comparison to the subject matter and the loss of the people I'm often exploring in my work. Nonetheless, it's there. And just for artists who are listening out there, as a side note, when you choose to do this type of work, yeah, part of doing the work means personal work you have to do for yourself so that you can remain diligent and never look away. I turn to a lot of war journalists and war correspondents. I read, some have written some incredible memoirs, reading about what they saw and did. Every time I hear an interview of a physician or a health worker today, the burden of those nurses in our hospitals right now, I'm not doing their work, but I get what they're saying as far as what comes with that, and that you need help to navigate through that so that you can make it, for the long term. So it has changed me forever. But it's reinforced my belief that this work should be done, that art can do that work, and that I need to do the work on myself that allows me to do it for as long as I can. And I don't think that's something that young artists always get talked to about, is what is the work you have to do on yourself to enable you to remain diligent and focused on these types of topics over these times of periods of time. Anyway, I'll stop there, but Ellery, can you add something on here? No?
All right, and a comment from someone who's familiar with your work says, I see links in this body of work in your work on artificial hearts and your questions about living without a heartbeat, and your work on the golden record and existence beyond the known limits of the universe.
Yes, it's all, there's a connective thread through it all. And what drives it all is empathy. I mean, I believe the ultimate function of art is to expand and evolve our capacity for empathy. And I like to argue that there is no reason to think empathy has stopped evolving. It certainly has evolving counter forces to it in our culture through technology and any number of things. Every generation has to take the core premise and reinvent the tools to allow it to flourish. And that's an ongoing project. So when I'm drawn to other stories like the history of the artificial heart or the ultimate existential question, are we alone in the universe? And the other flip side of that question, what would we say back if we got a signal tomorrow? My philosophies on empathy drive all of those decisions, and the fact that I would choose those subjects. Like the artificial heart, I'm not sure who asked the question, but you probably know why one of the reasons I'm so interested in that is because it was a cultural shift in how we understood our own bodies, but more importantly, how we understood each other. And if science is going to take out a defining feature of our humanity, which is a beating heart, and replace it with a machine, and perhaps a machine that doesn't even beat at all, that's profound in the way we relate to each other and perhaps how we can show empathy to each other. And to me, it's not coincidental that so many of the spouses of those early operations, when their partner came out of surgery, one of the first things they would ask is, "Do you still love me?" That is like these other abstractions we've been talking about tonight. I've really spent a lot of time thinking about that. There's another category of a type of frontline experience of loss that's verbalized in for many, an overly sentimental way. Do you still love me? And therefore it doesn't get put into any proper histories or serious intellectual discussion. And I would argue, at minimum, it should be right up front with all the other profound questions of an artificial heart. I even tend to think it's the most important question. Yeah, do you still love me? That's a great question to ask. Because it pokes at deep philosophical traditions about who we are and where are we, especially our emotions in our body. But how do we give those to each other? How do we express them outside of our bodies? And the heartbeat, when push comes to shove, it has a lot of lineage that still matters as far as how we give our hearts to each other as acts of love and empathy. Ellery, you got to jump in this time. I'm going on way too much.
Oh, I think we're so lucky to have your presence here to share. I think I keep coming back to this idea of contact and connection and communication in your work, of using and visibility or visualization in terms of transforming a human heartbeat into your research into the kind of graphic record of a human heartbeat, something that seems kind of inconceivable, and giving concrete form to that abstraction. That's also about questions of, communication and connection, and what is more human than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Taylor, I'll let you decide.
Yeah, we have two more outstanding questions right now, so I think we can go ahead with those, and then we'll put the kibosh on future questions. So the first is about, Dario, your early involvement with hospice work. And then to paraphrase the next question, someone is asking, how do we grieve for future losses? And how does that idea play into your work?
That's a great question. And I would say, it's in that category of a type of abstraction of what could have been. In this case, which, not frame the same way, but it's in that category of alternate paths. But by thinking forward rather than back, it adds a twist to the problem that I find fascinating, because it's still, like with the knowledge that war cuts short potential life, how do you move forward with that knowledge now that you've articulated it and verbalized it, or hopefully visualized it in some way that it can be identified as a problem? That question is highly relevant to the environment, of course, right now. And a question that has fueled many projects is, I think, in the spirit of that forward-thinking question there, which is, okay, we could argue in the 10, 20,000 years ago, even further back, humans didn't yet have a moral foundation to ask a question like, what does it mean to push another creature to extinction? That your species is the reason for another creature being pushed out of existence. Okay, so we didn't have the moral apparatus or the visual, the artistic or craft traditions to respond to that or mourn for it. But we can't say that anymore. That we're not off the hook anymore. We know what we're doing. And so that gives a way to be proactive on the problem. I think art equally plays a role moving forward on those questions as it does in the way I framed it looking back. And anyway, I can go on more about that. I probably have too much to say about it right now. The hospice point, I wonder if my mother asked that question. I think she's here tonight. But hospice transformed me as a human. I said this many times. I always take an opportunity to say so, but when people ask who is my favorite artist, with zero irony, I say hospice nurses, because it's true. And I got to spend time around some of them. My mother ran a hospice, worked at a hospice. My mother's such an incredible model for everything I hope art can do. In her superhuman capacity to love and care for others, and being around hospice nurses whose day to day activity was to care for others beyond all normal expectations. It set the bar so high for what I thought I was capable of. And then when I became an artist, it transferred on to the practice of art itself. That why should we assume we've hit our threshold in our capacity for empathetic behavior through the production of art or just how we treat each other? And when I look back on those years, I realized that is why I have this model in my head, that not only does our capacity for empathy have to constantly be updated, but in theory, there's no boundary line. We can keep going. And I want to just keep going. I want to find a way for art to facilitate that. So anyway, hospice is an incredible thing humans have invented, and I support hospice nurses everywhere. So Ellery, do you want to add on to that?
I just wanted to thank you so much for giving us this space and time in which to think about the historical past and the future and our own moment, and to kind of, think about our limits and our capacities for connection and communication and making meaning of existence. So goodness, thank you so much. I feel so grateful.
Thank you, Ellery. And thank you for introducing me to Henry's work. And I like that I can slot that in now too, as well as a lineage that I'm part of. I love that.
And I don't want to press too much on both of your time, but I do have a question that I'd love to hear both of your responses to. So art history as a discipline has famously been called a melancholy art, and the role of the art historian has been characterized by some as this job of reanimation of dead objects. And I'm just curious what both of your sort of immediate thoughts and gut reactions to that statement is.
Taylor, do you mind saying one more time the statement? I missed some of it.
The idea that art history is a melancholy art, as it's been called, and that the art historian's prerogative is to reanimate the dead, almost corpses of these objects.
Okay, Ellery, this is in your court.
I'm laughing because my primary research focus and book project is about 19th century obsessions with perfection and its preservation, the desire to kind of stop time at a perfect moment that will prevent change or decay. And what I find, and this transcends kind of art and natural history projects, an obsessive bodybuilder who kind of transformed himself into a sculpture. But what I find is that it's, of course, impossible. Vitality and perfection are incompatible. The artist is always killing the thing he's trying to study or preserve. And I think I'm still grappling with whether I think that's always the case, or whether it just seems to be the case for these historical figures that I've studied. But I think some of what I find really meaningful about museum practice and the works that Dario is talking about as well are their vitality, their kind of efforts to reach out and communicate kind of beyond the physical embodied life of a single individual. That's my attempt at an answer.
Taylor, does that sound melancholic to you? It's also hopeful to
It is. I went to Middlebury College and was in the art history department, and one of the essays that you read in the methodology class is this essay about art history being a melancholy art, and it honestly made me cry. It made me feel like this task that we've set ourselves as art historians is so hopeful and is such a vital reanimating initiative. So it sounds incredibly hopeful to me.
Yeah, and negotiating between both. I have always called myself a tragic optimist because I get both sides of that and I see how they fuel each other. And maybe I think that's the spirit of what you're getting at. Accepting the melancholy of any given topic or situation is never, for me, a sign to quit or give up. It's to press on, even if that's the state, the natural, whatever the topic I'm studying. So yeah, that push and pull. I'm glad I don't know the essay, Taylor, but I'm assuming it didn't end with why bother if it's melancholic, right? Okay, because that I wouldn't ascribe to.
I just wanted to thank you both so very much. It was profoundly moving and thought-provoking, and it's absolutely so much appreciated. So thank you. I think it's quite late, so it was exhausting, I'm sure, but appreciate and good night, and we'll be in touch. Thank you to everybody who came.
Thank you to everyone. Thank you.
Everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye, Ellery.
Bye, Dario.
Bye, everyone.